Chapter 34. The Clique. By New Year's Eve, I was packing to leave again. I couldn't help but feel like a tired horse being hitched to the wagon one more time. I had a feeling that 1995 was going to be a telltale year for me. I told myself that it was out of my hands and just to do my best. After having been off for 6 weeks, it was downright weird to be in the dressing room at the Houston Summit. I rubbed my weary eyes at the sight of Captain Kirk standing right in front of me. William Shatner was there to do a bit spot on Raw to promote his new sci-fi series, Tech Wars. He was an agreeable sort of guy, but all business. At the end of my match with Jeff Jarrett, whose manager was the roadie, I have a vague memory of telling Captain Kirk, "Go ahead, give the roadie one more." I was more than amused to watch Shatner drop the roadie with an elbow smash and fire him over the top rope. Meanwhile, Jim missed several shots after Christmas and got himself fired again. It was too bad, because Vince had been going to put the tag belts on him and Owen would have been the perfect babysitter. It didn't help when Ellie dug him a deeper hole by calling J.J. Dillon and Vince's secretaries to plead for Jim's job. When it was to no avail, she cursed them all out. Davey was also faltering in the face of a serious drug problem. One minute he'd be talking to me and the next minute he'd completely zone out. He was also distraught because his mother was dying of stomach cancer back in England. While riding with me he took so many somas of potent and popular muscle relaxant and pain reliever that he turned into a trembling zombie, slurring over and over, "I've got problems." Since taking the belt, Diesel had proven he didn't have enough experience to have a good match with Backlund. To the serious fans, he'd had a short climb to the top and it was damn near impossible for him to get anything close to sympathy, being a giant badass trucker. But after I got back in January, Kevin seemed less interested in advice from me and I began to notice how Sean, Razor and Kid cozied up to him as if he were a prized Great Dane. They were all trying to sniff his ass. I'd had mine sniffed enough to know. Kevin was soon resented by some of the other wrestlers because he wasn't a champion for all of us, but only for his little band of buddies. On January 22, 1995, we had a title match at the Royal Rumble. Vince was worried that his new superstar could end up a total heel, which would be bad for business. My fans wanted me to get the belt back, and I assured Kevin that the only way to go was to let me be the aggressor, yet keep him strong. After a solid back-and-forth battle, with all kinds of outside interference from Owen, Sean, Backlund, Jarrett, and the roadie, the match finally ended in a disqualification. Afterwards, Kevin shook my hand and thanked me for giving him his first decent match as champion. He didn't seem to understand that all I would have had to do to turn him heel was to have started selling dramatically, but I didn't operate like that. Sean won the Battle Royal, which set up his main event spot facing Diesel at WrestleMania 11. But NFL All-Star defensive linebacker Lawrence Taylor was sitting in the front row and ended up stealing the show right out from under Sean and Diesel when he got pie-faced by an irate Bam Bam Bigelow. Just like with Yoko, Diesel's head got very big, very fast on the promises Vince fed him to make him feel important and the big checks, the perks and the almighty spotlight. But Kevin was also finding out that being champion was a lot of hard work. Just like me, he believed Vince when he was told that he'd be champion for a long time. But Diesel wasn't drawing, and it agitated him that the hype leading up to WrestleMania 11 was focused not on him but on a match between Bam Bam and Lawrence Taylor. At a press conference in San Francisco, Sean and Diesel openly sat together in front of the fans and the media, a complete and utter disrespect for kayfabe from the champion and his opponent. Even though by then some fans, the so-called smart marks, were starting to understand pro wrestling was a work, not to kayfabe was an intentional affront to old school ways and an insult to the other wrestlers. It was bad for the business and I couldn't have been more disappointed in them both. A tenacious WCW was adding more pay-per-views. Vince had exclusivity deals with many of the cable conglomerates that aired the WWF, similar to the deals that kept anyone else from running wrestling in his buildings. To maintain control of the cable outlets and hold on to the pay-per-view industry that he in large part helped create in the first place, Vince soon promised to deliver a pay-per-view every month. What started out as the annual WrestleMania extravaganza each spring had already grown to 5 major shows a year with the addition of King of the Ring in June, SummerSlam in August, Survivor Series in November, and Royal Rumble in January. Now, for every month that there wasn't an already established pay-per-view, we were going to do a new series called In Your House. WrestleMania would still be the biggest show of the year, with the original Big Four feeding it and the In Your House pay-per-views keeping the storylines going. The danger was that with so many pay-per-views between the two promotions, the market would become saturated and the big shows would become nothing special. Not to mention that it was getting too expensive for the casual fan, who, as a result, would be forced to choose between WWF or WCW. In Your House was scheduled to debut in May, and Vince would need his depleted, burned out crew of wrestlers to dig a little deeper to help him turn the tide against WCW. Color announcer Jim Ross had just become Vince's right-hand man in the booking department, with Pat staying close to Florida now. For the first one, they booked Hakushi to work with me, but Vince also wanted me to work on the same show against Lawler and put him over in order to build for a huge rematch at King of the Ring. On April 2nd, I flew down to Hartford for WrestleMania 11 with Dallas and Blade. I was dreading my match with Bob because I knew Vince's idea that the two of us would use only submission holds in the match was guaranteed to stink the building out. When I marched out to face Bob, I got a huge pop, but from the moment the bell rang, the match went downhill. Roddy Piper was the guest referee and kept sticking a live mic in our faces, asking, "What do you say?" which only sounded comical and made the crowd laugh. I cringed, thinking nobody laughs during my matches unless I want them to. As hard as Bob and I tried, the match deteriorated into a farce. Finally, Bob went for his chicken wing, and I slipped under and reversed it, hooking his hold on him, falling backward to the mat. Bob was finding out, as I had, that the hold hurt like hell, so bad that as Roddy stuck the mic in Bob's face and asked, "Do you give?" Bob could only manage to scream, "Yes." Bob was specifically supposed to say, "I quit," but with the painful hold cutting off his air, Roddy finally had no choice but to ring the bell and declare me the winner. This was, without a doubt, my worst pay-per-view match ever. Diesel had a good match with Shawn, in which they both worked hard, but Shawn went out of his way to outshine the champion, reminding me of a Bugs Bunny cartoon in which Bugs outsmarted a ferocious but clueless bull. When Shawn gave Diesel his superkick finish and covered him, Earl Hebner twisted his ankle as planned, and after an eternity he finally crawled over to make the count. When Diesel kicked out to boos, I immediately knew that Shawn had played him. Diesel would, in fact, beat Shawn moments later, but it wouldn't be enough to build Diesel up for their return match at the In Your House pay-per-view coming up in June. All anyone would remember about Diesel's championship match at WrestleMania was Shawn Michaels, which was, clearly, what Shawn intended all along. In the ensuing panic in the dressing room, all plans were scrubbed, and Shawn was turned babyface the following night on Raw. As for the main event, Lawrence Taylor put in a damn good effort, considering how inexperienced he was. Bam Bam worked his ass off carrying LT through the match and put him over with an elbow smash off the second rope, the saving grace in what was the worst WWF pay-per-view I could remember. Shawn's sudden face change threw a monkey wrench into everything. I saw right away that he was my direct competition now. I had been around for 11 years, 5 straight as a babyface, so some of the fans were looking for a new star, and clearly it was going to be Shawn. He wasn't tough enough to pretend to be Bret Hart. There's no denying that he was a great talent, but a great worker has to be able to wrestle everyone, and Shawn was only capable of carrying the opponents that suited him. He had the girls screaming for him when he did silly flare spots, like having his opponent pull his trunks down to his ankles during a sunset flip, but most of the men in the audience hated him for being too much of a cutie boy. After TVs on April 5th, I stood off on the side of the road with Dallas and Blade on a dark starlit night, arcing our piss in 3 varied heights. As the moon peeked out between clouds, I felt proud as I wondered how many other wrestling dads over the years had enjoyed this same kind of moment with their sons. Bang! On April 21st, I was in Germany again. There was a lot of negative talk among the boys about Diesel, Shawn, Razor and their rather obvious clique. Most of the wrestlers were finding Shawn's attitude hard to take and were relieved that he wasn't on the tour. The boys were always the first to feel a slide in business, and many of them let me know that they were much happier with their payoffs when I was champion. It reminded me of how I felt when Warrior took the belt from Hogan. I sat with Davey, Lex and Jeff Jarrett at the Sugar Shack in Munich. I may have been a toppled king, but I was still tearing the house down every night, especially in Europe. Davey had cut his hair and now sported a flat top that gave him a fresh, chiseled look, and he was enthusiastic about the possibility of forming a new tag team with Lex. I enjoyed reminiscing with him about our old Stampede days and soon had him laughing about the time Jim stuck fish eyes in the pockets of Davey's pants. I was happy to see him laugh, and I kept giving him little jabs in the ribs every time he tried to order. He'd been laughing so hard, with those big dimples showing, that he was never able to get his order in. He told me he hoped to work with me again and that he was thinking of turning heel just so he could challenge me. Fukin Clique's trying to take over now, he said. Fukin Shawn is barely 200 pounds sopping wet. Shawn's a decent guy, but he's got his little hang-ups, I replied. Unfortunately, one of them is being an asshole. I celebrated the safe end of another tour at Cookies in Frankfurt and thought about how I could blow them away at In Your House by working 2 totally different matches with Hakushi and Lawler. Diesel was wrestling Psycho Sid as a carryover from WrestleMania 11, and I doubted they could top me. What Sid Audi lacked as a worker he made up for as a great-looking specimen. He was well-muscled at 6'9", with a big square jaw and curly blonde hair. Owen and Yoko were going to win the tag belts at In Your House, which would help now that Owen and Martha were expecting their second child in October. Owen and I had no idea if or when we would ever work together again. And I kidded him, "Don't worry. We'll do the dance of death somewhere down the line." Our match wasn't expected to mean much as Hakushi and I opened that first In Your House, on May 14, 1995, in Syracuse, but we completely blew them away with unexpected aerial moves that had only been seen in Japan. Then I rolled him up tighter than a sushi roll for the pinfall. Diesel and Sid delivered the kind of subpar match that was to be expected. My second match, with Lawler, had a ton of heat, especially when Hakushi interfered by helping Lawler steal a pinfall on me. At the end of the night, Vince told me that my matches saved the show. Kevin was irritable and gave me a look as though he wanted to kick that gold belt across the dressing room floor to me. Over the next few weeks I watched Sid and Diesel struggle to carry the main event while I cruised through matches with Hakushi. Meanwhile, Lawler and I were building heat for a rematch at King of the Ring, for which I'd obliged Lawler by letting him come up with any kind of match he wanted. I got Chris Benoit a tryout at TV in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, on June 7th, working with Owen. They put on a wrestling clinic that would have impressed any wrestler anywhere. There was another new arrival from WCW, Paul Levesque, a hook-nosed bodybuilder who came out of Killer Kowalski's wrestling school. He was a decent worker who was quick to cozy up to his old pal Kevin Nash. That night, I drove to Pittsburgh with Owen and Benoit. I could tell by the way Owen talked about the baby coming that he relished having a second child. Benoit looked really happy for him, and I realized then that these two were close. Like Owen, Chris was a notorious ribber, and I enjoyed hearing of their old antics when they were in Calgary and Japan together. I thought for sure Benoit would be hired, but both Pat and Jim Ross passed on him for reasons that nobody in their right mind could ever understand, especially considering that Vince was so low on talent. There was the usual fired-up Philly crowd for King of the Ring on June 25, a growing number of whom were becoming hardcore ECW supporters, largely because the promotion was based there. The match of Lawler's choosing turned out to be a kiss my foot match. The silliness of it ended up being just what this crowd was looking to sink their teeth into. Lawler and I delivered another intense brawl, which ultimately ended with me propped up on the top corner, plucking my laces, pulling off my boot, and cramming my toes into Jerry's mouth. I even crunched Jerry up like an accordion and stuck his own toes into his mouth. Diesel injured his elbow, which was a real no-no for the champion, because everything was built around him and now he couldn't work. Payoffs were down, morale too. On that flight home I finally found time to study my lines for my first episode of the new season of Lonesome Dove. I'd done 2 shows as Mountain Man Luther Root and was now written in as a semi-regular character. I saw Lonesome Dove as a sabbatical from wrestling. I'd still wrestle weekends, but I'd finally have more time at home, where I celebrated my 38th birthday and my 13th wedding anniversary. I spent time with my kids riding hard around the bike paths of Calgary to keep up my cardio conditioning and the elasticity in my knees. My world was spinning as fast as the blurred spokes of my wheels. Blade rode in front of me, and I had to admire him when he said, "Don't worry about me, man. I'm a happy little kid." So was I. Sean was now the Intercontinental Champ. While I'd been home, the Clique had managed to maneuver themselves into all the top spots, and it wasn't sitting well with the boys in the dressing room. I showed up for Raw in Louisville, Kentucky, on July 24th, where I was booked against Hakushi again. I liked him enough to have established him as a serious heel, but, unfortunately, because of his kindly nature, everyone who had worked with him since had made a point of eating him up. He seemed relieved to see me and got real serious when I explained that we'd just have to go out and show them all over again. I put together a match filled with all the aerial moves we thought were too risky to do at our In Your House match. Midway through it, I was on the floor when Hakushi hit the far ropes and did a cartwheel, a handspring and then back somersaulted over the top rope, spinning right on top of me in what Dave Meltzer aptly described as the first space-flying tiger drop ever seen in the United States. With one kick out after another, we tore the house down until I suplexed him standing off the top and twisted him in the sharpshooter. The Louisville Gardens came unglued. Back in the dressing room, Owen stood with a bunch of the other wrestlers clapping as he said staccato, "The best there is. The best there was. The best there ever will be." Davey Boy double-crossed Lex and turned heel. Undertaker was, once again, called upon to work a miracle, this time with Mabel, who had won the King of the Ring crown. And Bob Backlund was running for President of the United States. Not really, but they had a lot of people actually believing that he was a candidate. As an offshoot to my on and off feud with Lawler, the storyline continued that his mouth had become infected from my toes, so I was now to wrestle his dentist, Dr. Isaac Yankem, at SummerSlam in August. Yankem was actually a curly-haired, broad-shouldered 6'8" rookie named Glenn Jacobs, who'd only just started working Lawler's Memphis territory. He later became known as Kane. I found it hard to get excited about working the cartoon storylines that Vince had for me, especially a September In Your House match I was supposed to have with Pierre Lafitte because he stole my ring jacket. I did my best to make these lame angles fly. The night after Evansville TV's at Mattingly's, a sports bar owned by the New York Yankees, Taker sat with me and confided that he didn't trust Sean. While I'd been away, the clique had been prancing around acting like their shit didn't stink. Our attention turned to a disturbance at the far end of the bar. Sean had made some kind of a racial slur, and the situation was escalating because Razor stepped in and head-butted a black guy. Diesel was their standing guard over Sean, who'd taken a handful of somas and was in no shape to back up his own words. Lurking in the shadows was Paul Levesque, who was now working as a snooty, rich aristocrat named Hunter Hearst Helmsley, eventually to be known as Triple H. With him was his girlfriend, Joni Lauer, a fellow graduate from Kowalski's school, who was now working as his valet, China. She was a female bodybuilder who resembled the Incredible Hulk cartoon character with a black wig on, but spoke with a little, squeaky high voice. China was built better than most of the boys, but as far as I know Vince didn't steroid test the girls. Earlier that day Vince had told me Diesel wasn't cutting it as champion, making the excuse that it was because of his elbow. But I'd always thought that Diesel was as good as dead after he worked with Shawn back at WrestleMania 11. I suggested to Vince that Kevin needed sympathy, and I knew how to get it for him. I could beat him for the belt by using an idea that came to me while watching Sabu in ECW crashing through tables. It was a new finish designed around dropping the belt back to Kevin at WrestleMania 12. As I explained it to Vince, he frantically scribbled it in his big black book. 3 days later, wrestling was all a strange, faraway dream. I sat on the Lonesome Dove set in a saloon called the Ambrosia Club waiting for my next scene. I was thrilled to hear that it was all but certain that I'd be a full-time cast member next season, playing the sheriff in all 16 episodes. On August 6th, Vince called to tell me that he wanted me to win the belt at Survivor Series by crashing through a table. I listened to Vince tell me my finish as if I'd never heard it before. The only thing I could come up with was that he'd read what he'd written down in his black book and somehow actually thought it was his idea. All I could do was hope that he'd write down all my ideas from now on. But it was Shawn he wanted me to drop the belt to at WrestleMania, not Kevin. Do you have any problems with that? I thought about it. Despite how the boys felt about him, Shawn was a hard worker and had paid his dues as far as I could see. Of course I had no problem with it. The timing was perfect. I could go right into my sheriff role, filming all summer long, and reappear just in time for SummerSlam 96. By mid-August, Pat stepped down to take a break, voluntarily making room for Vince to hire Jim Ross's mentor, the one-time Louisiana promoter, and more recently WCW booker, Bill Watts. I took this as a positive, especially since Watts was a hard-nosed, in-your-face, tough guy who liked his wrestling to look real. I had a better match than anyone expected with Dr. Isaac Yankem at SummerSlam. I was pleased to find that despite being green, Glenn Jacobs had a willingness to listen and learn. I told him to be proud of himself, and he was. On September 4th, WCW launched a Monday night show called Monday Nitro to go head-to-head with Monday Night Raw. The centerpiece of their debut show was a surprise appearance by Lex Luger, who, like Randy, had read the writing on the wall and left the WWF before it was too late. Owen and Yoko lost the belts to a young cowboy team called the Smokin' Guns. Owen was now the proud father of a brand new baby girl, Athena. For all those times he'd pulled pranks on me, I'd told everyone, straight-faced, that he named her after Stu. It was kind of funny how mad he got when everybody kept congratulating him on the birth of his daughter Stella. I enjoyed finally paying him back. I didn't mind putting Shawn over at WrestleMania 12, but I knew that Shawn wasn't the guy to fill my shoes, and I was damn sure he wouldn't draw any better than I did. One big difference between me and Shawn, which would cost him, was that I appreciated my undercard. I always took the time to shake the hands of even the lowest jobber. A relatively small babyface always needs the heels to make him, but Shawn treated a lot of the wrestlers like they weren't good enough to work with him. The clique had managed to alienate themselves from nearly everyone, even the ring crew. Ron Harris, one of the big, bald-headed twins called the Blues Brothers, didn't take kindly to Shawn's remarks about his match. He grabbed a terrified Shawn by the neck in the shower at Madison Square Garden and told him if he asked him again he'd shove his head up his ass. Shawn had even berated Chief, in what was the beginning of the end for one of Vince's most loyal generals. Bill Watts lasted only a few weeks, resigning on October 13th when he realized that Vince just wasn't listening to him. It got back to me that Watts quit over Vince putting the belt on Shawn. He thought Shawn was too damn scrawny and that the belt should stay with me. Vince brought Pat back to work with him on booking, but lessened his load by putting Jerry Briscoe in charge of all the wrestlers. Briscoe cozied up to me, pretending to be an old friend, one of the boys, and as there didn't seem to be any choice, I tried to trust him. The day after Watts resigned, Shawn yapped off one too many times, this time to a bunch of Marines in a Syracuse bar. According to Davey, who was there with Kid, Shawn hit on a soldier's girl, who was waitressing. By the end of the night the three wrestlers were loaded up on somas, and the willing waitress offered to drive them back to their hotel. They staggered out to their car, only to be met by, depending on what version of the story you believe, 4 to 9 angry Marines. The three of them were helpless. The soldiers jerked Shawn out of the front seat, and Davey and Kid fumbled in slow motion to get out of the back. Kid made a pathetic attempt to throw some karate kicks, but he was so out of it they pushed him over like a scarecrow. Davey was so pilled up that he was barely able to stand, but as hard as they tried, they couldn't take him down. He winced when he told me how they slammed Shawn's head in the car door and pummeled him with fists and boots, with Shawn too drugged up to even put his hands up to shield his face. At In Your House in Winnipeg on October 22, Shawn made a brief appearance, explaining that he'd been jumped by 9 Marines and would be out of action for a while. He conveniently forfeited the Intercontinental belt to Razor that same day, via an ECW import called Shane Douglas, so he could go home while his face healed up. Because the IC belt was still a big money spot, the attitude in the dressing room was that it was the clique looking out for their own again. I was a guest announcer for Diesel's match with Davey, and we got into a pie-face pushing kind of thing while I was at the announcer's table. Diesel got no help from the Canadian audience, and the match bombed badly enough that Vince hurled his headset down in disgust and hissed, "Horrible." It was around this time that WCW accomplished the unthinkable by beating Vince in the ratings, which only made things seem that much worse. My match with Diesel at Survivor Series was brutally physical. We complimented each other, working and building the match for more than 25 minutes until I dove over the top onto Diesel. He moved out of the way and I bounced hard off the padded floor. Diesel pulled himself up the ropes and back into the ring while I slowly got to my feet. Walking past the announcer's table I began to climb up on the apron when Diesel charged past Earl Hebner, using the top rope to catapult me crashing backward into the table, which was nowhere near gimmicked enough. It didn't break the way it was supposed to and it was a loud, bruising crash. As I lay hurt and helpless atop the shattered table, Diesel came out and tossed me into the ring like a rag doll, all the while taking his time appearing to be upset about it. He raised his black-gloved fist and pulled me up for his jackknife finish when I dropped and folded him up in a quick small package for the 1, 2, 3. The crowd exploded. On what was my 41st pay-per-view, I won the WWF World title for the 3rd time. Diesel furiously bumped down the ref and gave me not 1, but 2, very sloppy and painful jackknife power bombs that knocked all the wind out of me. Referees hit the ring like Keystone Cops, and Diesel left them lying on the mat. In an unscripted moment, he stood over top of me, dropped the world belt across my chest, glared down and snarled, "Don't forget who did you the fucking favor." This was the same guy who, 2 years earlier, did nothing but suck up to me. I thought Vince would play up the fact that I was now a 3-time WWF World Champion, but I was wrong. The day after I regained the title, Raw was live from Richmond, Virginia, but the announcers only mentioned in passing that I was champ again, showing a brief clip of the match. It was Shawn's first day back since getting beat up, and he and Diesel took center stage. Diesel made out like it was a tainted win for me. Not all the fans bought the pay-per-views, but everyone watched Raw, and for a while Diesel's side was all a lot of them had to go on. Later in the show, Owen worked a dandy little match where he jumped up and delivered an Inoki-style spin kick to the back of Shawn's head. According to plan, Shawn carried on briefly, but then collapsed to one knee and fell unconscious. Soon paramedics frantically worked on him and Vince was in the ring, his headset off, looking visibly distressed. Owen played confused and left Shawn alone. And that was how they went off the air. It was done so realistically that almost everyone watching on live TV thought Shawn was really hurt. There were tearful girls everywhere, overshadowing the fact that the world title had changed hands. 2 days after I won the belt, they finally had me do an interview, but it was on the taped Raw, which wouldn't even air until a week later. Such tactics certainly weren't designed to make the champ look strong. In fact, before I'd even said a word, Backlund came out of nowhere and chicken-winged me until I was rescued by referees and agents, and helped to the back. I'd given Vince a 5-star match with Diesel, but it was so quickly passed over that it was soon forgotten. Even the build-up to my In Your House match against Davey on December 17th was non-existent, with all the attention being lavished on the ex-champion and the apparently seriously injured Shawn. Diesel continued to imply during his live TV interviews that I only got the belt back because I sucked up to Vince. I now had the belt, but I didn't have the power that usually came with it. Clearly Diesel and Shawn were in control, and I was only carrying the belt until Shawn could dispose of me at WrestleMania 12. What with Hogan, Lex and Diesel having failed at taking my position, Vince seemed determined to put me in a holding pattern and make certain that Shawn became the new king. Vince must have realized that he had to do something with my match with Davey, so he flew Diana to Richmond TVs with the idea that maybe Diana could turn heel on me too. I didn't like it one bit. First of all, I thought it took away from Owen being the black sheep, but also with so many relatives turning on me, Owen, Jim, Davey, Bruce and now Diana, along with Diesel saying that I was a suck-up, a lot of fans would have to conclude that I must be hard to like. Vince suggested that Owen, Davey, Diana and I talk over what we should do. Diana said matter-of-factly, "I'll just tell Vince that I'll do whatever he wants me to do." I gasped and warned her never ever say you'll do anything they want. They'll make you shave your head and walk backward out there. A few minutes later, Owen and I stood talking privately in the hall outside Vince's office. Owen had real concerns that Diana would come off looking bad as a mother and a parent and make the whole family look bad. Then we noticed Diana eavesdropping from around the corner. When we all went to Vince's office to talk about it, Diana ignored our warnings. Her very first words to Vince were, "I'll do whatever you tell me to do, Vince." She so infuriated me and Owen that we shot the whole idea down in front of Vince, who decided it would be best to leave her out of things until Davey's upcoming assault trial was finished. I racked my brain for weeks trying to think of a way to make the match mean anything at all. Davey offered nothing, relying on me to figure it all out. My mind was a big blank. It was while driving to the Hershey Park Arena on the day of the match that I saw a pharmacy sign and it dawned on me that a little accidental blood would change everything. I bought razor blades and scissors. As I headed out to the ring, I was determined to break Vince's holding pattern and blow them away one more time. Davey and I spent 15 minutes building a two-part story. As I'd anticipated, in the early going the crowd was less than captivated by our storyline. After giving them an unsurprising part 1, I straddled Davey atop a turnbuckle and climbed up to attempt a standing suplex off the top rope. But when I went to suplex him, he blocked it, and with his amazing strength he lifted me and threw me crotch first onto the top rope. The crowd gasped as I collapsed to the floor, where I discreetly coughed the blade out of my mouth. When I got up, Davey charged me from behind, leveling me headfirst into the steel steps. I cut high in the hairline and blood poured hot. As Davey worked me over, my head looked like a bloody pulp and even the simplest moves popped now. People praised Robert De Niro for his dedication when he gained 150 pounds to become Jake LaMotta for Raging Bull. How come the same compliment isn't paid to pro wrestlers who bleed in the name of realism? After a desperate climax of false finishes, I wrapped Davey up in an old school Oklahoma roll for the pin. When I got back to the dressing room, the mission doctor declared, "It's a cut from the stairs." As he put 5 stitches in my head. Dave Meltzer described it as yet another 5-star performance. Slowly, I was earning Meltzer's respect. And I was proud of the fact that Meltzer and all the other wrestling fans could never say for sure that I bladed intentionally. After the TVs the next day, a bunch of us were up in Kurt's room drinking beers. Razor had taken a handful of somas and wilted in a slow-motion sit-up. Soon he was floating off to dreamland while the rest of us sat around telling war stories. Mabel was really bummed out, having taken some heat for collapsing on Taker while delivering an elbow drop, shattering Taker's eye socket. Luckily, Taker would be able to work around it as long as he wore a protective purple mask, resembling something out of Phantom of the Opera. Kurt sang my praises while denouncing the clique to the 1-2-3 Kid. Staring at Razor, Kurt rummaged through his toilet bag, hit the switch on an electric shaver and casually buzzed off Razor's right eyebrow. Kid took up for Scott as Kurt menaced the other eyebrow. "Don't do it, Kurt, come on." At first Kurt heeded Kid, but when we all thought he'd forgotten, he suddenly blurted out, "Fuck you, Kid." He hit the switch and shaved off Razor's left eyebrow. Razor never budged, only managing a dreamy smile.